Griffin, Georgia, a quiet, unassuming town nestled in the heart of the American South. The kind of place where life moved at a predictable pace, where neighbors exchanged polite waves, and where the biggest concern for most was whether the summer heat would last through October. It was not the kind of town where people expected to wake up to news of a violent crime. But as history had proven time and time again, darkness had a way of creeping into even the most unsuspecting corners of the world. At first glance, the Boyntons appeared to be the embodiment of a small-town success story. Matthew Boynton, a young, ambitious police officer, had followed in the footsteps of his grandfather, a respected figure in law enforcement. He was well-liked in the department, seen as a promising recruit with a bright future ahead. Tall, with the authoritative posture of someone trained to command a room, he carried himself with the kind of confidence that came naturally to those who believed they were untouchable. Jessica Boynton, just 19 years old, had seemingly stepped into the life that many young women in small-town America were expected to aspire to. A stable home, a husband with a respectable job, 2 children to care for. From the outside, she had it all, but those who knew her well could sense that beneath the surface, something was terribly wrong. In public, she smiled. She played the role of the devoted wife, but in private, cracks had begun to form in the carefully constructed image of domestic bliss. She was unhappy. And worse than that, she was afraid. The marriage, which had begun with youthful optimism, had soured almost as soon as it had started. Matthew was controlling, domineering. Jessica confided in close friends that she felt like a prisoner in her own home, that her every move was watched, her every action criticized. She spoke of feeling trapped, of wanting to leave, but she had nowhere to go. Divorce had been discussed, but the idea of it filled her with dread. Matthew had threatened that if she left, he would take everything. The children, the home, the life she had built. He made it clear she would walk away with nothing. And in a town where Matthew's last name carried weight, Jessica knew her chances of winning a custody battle against him were slim. Still, she was determined to escape. In the days leading up to the incident, she had started making plans. Small, careful steps. She had begun gathering important documents, speaking to a few trusted friends about what she would need to do to start over. It wasn't easy. Every move had to be calculated. Every conversation had to be held in whispers. If Matthew suspected anything, she knew he would find a way to stop her. Then that night came. It was an ordinary evening, uneventful in every way except for the weight of the decision looming over Jessica. She was ready to leave. Matthew, as he often did, left the apartment late. He had a routine. He would meet up with another officer, grab a bite to eat, talk shop. It was the perfect window of opportunity for Jessica to put her plan into motion. She had already packed a small bag. If she could just get out, if she could just make it through the night, she might finally be free. But something went terribly wrong. Sometime after Matthew had left, the walls of the small apartment absorbed the sound of a gunshot, a single deafening blast that shattered the silence of the night. Jessica Boynton was found moments later, lying in the closet, a pool of blood spreading beneath her. The call to 911 came from Matthew himself. His voice was frantic, panicked. He told the dispatcher that his wife had shot herself, that he had received a distressing text message from her saying she couldn't go on any longer. But something about the scene didn't add up. Jessica was still alive, and soon investigators would uncover even more inconsistencies, details that didn't quite match the narrative Matthew was trying to sell. The small town of Griffin, Georgia, was about to become the center of a mystery that would leave more questions than answers. The night had been quiet, just like any other. The streets of Griffin, Georgia, had settled into their usual late-hour calm. The only sounds were the occasional passing cars, the distant murmur of a television left on too late, and the hum of cicadas in the darkness. But then, at an hour when most of the town was asleep, a gunshot shattered the silence. It came from an apartment in a modest residential complex, an apartment that belonged to Matthew and Jessica Boynton. Inside that apartment, the walls, the furniture, the very air itself seemed frozen in time. Jessica was on the floor, crumpled inside the walk-in closet, blood pooling beneath her head. A gun, Matthew's department-issued Glock .40, lay nearby. The door to the closet was shut, locked from the inside. The, the seconds ticked by, then minutes. The sound of the gunshot had not gone unnoticed. In the stillness that followed, no one could have known that this would be a moment that would fracture lives, that would turn a young mother's fate into a chilling enigma. Then came the call. 911 emergency. Matthew's voice came through the line, breathless, frantic. He told them his wife had shot herself, that he had received a message from her saying she couldn't take it anymore. He claimed he had tried to get into the room, but the door had been locked, that he had no way of knowing what was happening inside until it was too late. Within minutes, law enforcement arrived. Flashing blue and red lights bathed the exterior of the apartment building as officers rushed toward the entrance. What they found was unsettling. The bedroom was in order, no signs of a struggle, no overturned furniture, no objects strewn in disarray. Nothing about the room suggested a violent altercation had taken place. But beyond the bedroom, in the closet, Jessica lay still, her body motionless, blood soaking into the carpet. And yet, she was still breathing. A paramedic knelt beside her, quickly assessing her condition. She had suffered a head wound, and though her breathing was shallow, she was still alive. For someone who had allegedly inflicted such a devastating injury on herself, this was highly unusual. Most self-inflicted gunshot wounds of this nature resulted in immediate fatality, but Jessica, against all odds, had survived. This was the first inconsistency. As law enforcement began their initial assessment, more details stood out. Jessica's hands were clean. There was no gunpowder residue, no physical evidence suggesting she had fired a weapon at close range. The gun that had supposedly delivered the wound lay beside her, but her fingerprints weren't on it. A closer examination revealed yet another contradiction. The bullet's trajectory. It was not consistent with what would be expected in a self-inflicted wound. And then there was the closet door, locked, from the inside. If Jessica had truly attempted to take her own life, how had she managed to lock the door after pulling the trigger? These questions lingered in the air, unspoken but heavy. The officers exchanged glances. The paramedics continued their work, and outside the apartment, Matthew Boynton stood, watching. His expression was one of concern, of worry, but something about it felt too composed. One of the officers made his way toward him, notepad in hand. "What happened here?" Matthew recounted his story, how he had gone out to grab food with a fellow officer, how he had received a text from Jessica telling him goodbye, how he had rushed home and found the bedroom door locked, how he had heard the gunshot just before arriving. It was a carefully delivered account, smooth, rehearsed, as if he had already played out these words in his mind. But Jessica was still alive. Had she been awake, had she been able to speak, perhaps she could have given them a different story. But for now, all they had was Matthew's version of events. Her survival, however, changed everything. The night was thick with humidity, the kind that settled into the skin and refused to leave. The flashing lights from the patrol cars painted eerie shadows along the apartment complex's brick walls. Neighbors stood on their porches, their silhouettes framed against the glow of their doorways, whispering among themselves, craning their necks to catch a glimpse of what was unfolding just a few yards away. Inside, the air was heavy, thick with something unspoken, something wrong. Jessica Boynton had been found in the closet, her body sprawled unnaturally, her blonde hair darkened with blood. The gun, a Glock 40, lay beside her. It was the very weapon issued to her husband, Matthew Boynton, an officer with the local police department. But something about the scene didn't sit right. One of the officers, a veteran with years of experience in crime scene investigations, knelt beside the weapon. He had seen enough suicides to know what was supposed to be there, but there was something missing. No smudges, no fingerprints, nothing to indicate that Jessica had actually pulled the trigger. The gun was clean, too clean. Another officer dusted Jessica's hands, swabbing her skin carefully, testing for gunshot residue. It was a standard procedure, one that usually confirmed what was already obvious in these situations. If she had fired that weapon, there would be residue on her hands. Tiny traces of burnt powder, microscopic flecks of evidence that could not be washed away. The results came back faster than expected. Negative. That wasn't just unusual. It was nearly impossible. Jessica was still breathing, albeit weakly, her body fighting to hold on. Paramedics worked quickly, stabilizing her, moving her onto a stretcher, wheeling her through the cramped apartment hallway, and out toward the ambulance waiting outside. The officers knew that if she woke up, if she survived, she could tell them exactly what had happened in that room. But for now, the only version of the story they had belonged to Matthew. He stood outside, arms crossed over his chest, his police radio clipped to his belt, his uniform crisp despite the chaos surrounding him. His face was set in an expression of concern, but his eyes were unreadable. An officer approached him, notebook in hand. "Walk me through it." Matthew exhaled as if steadying himself, then pulled out his phone, scrolling through his messages. "She texted me," he said, turning the screen toward the officer. "Told me she was done, that she couldn't take it anymore." The officer took the phone, reading the message. It was short, abrupt, a goodbye. "I was at Waffle House with a buddy when I got the message," Matthew continued. "I got in my car and drove straight home. When I got here, the bedroom door was locked. I banged on it, tried to get inside. That's when I heard the gunshot." There was a pause. The only sound was the low murmur of voices from inside the apartment as investigators worked. "I called 911, he finished. It was a clean explanation. Too clean. Inside, the forensic team worked efficiently, documenting everything, photographing the blood splatter, the weapon, the angle at which Jessica had fallen. The more they studied the scene, the less it looked like a self-inflicted gunshot wound. The closet door was locked, from the inside. That fact alone made things complicated. If Jessica had shot herself, how had she managed to lock the door afterward? The latch was simple, a turn knob, the kind that clicked shut but wouldn't lock automatically. Someone had to physically engage it. Then there was the gunshot itself. The wound was severe, but the angle didn't line up. Most self-inflicted wounds followed a certain trajectory, an upward tilt if fired from under the chin, a straight shot if placed against the temple. But this wound, it didn't fit. Outside, Matthew paced, rubbing a hand over his face as if exhausted. He was playing the role of the worried husband well, but something about his body language was off. He wasn't frantic. He wasn't desperate for answers. He was just waiting. Officers began pulling records. They checked Jessica's phone, scrolling through her recent messages. They pulled Matthew's call log, looking for discrepancies. If this was just a tragic case of a young woman taking her own life, the evidence should align, but it didn't. The message Matthew had received, it had been sent only minutes before he called 911, but the paramedics estimated that Jessica had been on the ground, unresponsive, for longer than that. If she had texted him just before pulling the trigger, how had she lost consciousness so quickly? They checked her phone's metadata. The text hadn't come from the house's Wi-Fi. It had been sent through cellular data, meaning it could have been sent from anywhere. One of the officers made a note. If someone else had her phone, if someone else had sent that message, then this wasn't a suicide at all. They moved next to Matthew's alibi. His friend, the officer he had been with at the Waffle House, confirmed that Matthew had been there that night. Surveillance footage backed it up. The timestamps aligned. He had been seen ordering food, sitting at the table. But he had left the restaurant earlier than he claimed. Only by a few minutes. But in an investigation like this, a few minutes mattered. Jessica had been planning to leave him. That much had become clear as officers spoke with her friends, combed through her recent activities. She had been preparing, gathering important documents, reaching out to people who could help. She had known that staying in that house, staying with Matthew, was dangerous. And then, on the night she was supposed to leave, she was found bleeding in a locked closet. Coincidence? They didn't think so. The hospital hallways were sterile, cold, humming with the faint, monotonous beeping of machines. Nurses moved briskly between rooms, their white sneakers squeaking against the linoleum floor. Inside the intensive care unit, Jessica Boynton lay still, her body wrapped in hospital linens, her face pale, nearly lifeless. The machines did most of the work for her, keeping her alive, forcing her lungs to move, monitoring her heart as it fought to keep rhythm. It had been hours since the shooting, and though she had survived the bullet wound, the true battle had just begun. At the crime scene, Investigators weren't letting anything go unnoticed. The apartment had been sealed, and forensic specialists combed through every inch of it. The closet where Jessica had been found remained the primary focus. Officers had marked the exact spot where her body had lain, taking precise measurements of the gun's placement, the blood spatter, and the way her hair had fanned out against the floor. Every detail had to be accounted for. The inconsistencies were stacking up. The absence of gunshot residue on Jessica's hands, the lack of fingerprints on the weapon, the locked closet door. None of it aligned with the story Matthew Boynton had told them. The theory of a self-inflicted gunshot was growing thinner by the second. The trajectory of the bullet was the next piece of evidence under scrutiny. The forensic team ran simulations, analyzing how a person would have to position themselves to inflict such a wound. Most self-inflicted gunshot wounds to the head followed predictable angles, straight to the temple or from beneath the chin. But Jessica's wound, it didn't follow those patterns. The bullet had entered the back of her head at an angle that was difficult, if not impossible, for someone to have inflicted upon themselves. A chill ran through the investigators as they stared at the reports. Something was deeply wrong with this scene. If Jessica had not shot herself, then someone else had. And if someone else had done it, that meant a gunman had been inside that closet with her. But there was one glaring problem. The door was locked from the inside. It was a paradox, a puzzle that didn't fit. Had the killer somehow staged the scene to look like a suicide? Had they locked the door and escaped without being seen? Or had there been another hand involved, someone who had helped manipulate the crime scene? A seasoned investigator, the kind who had seen more than his share of death, rubbed his temple and exhaled. "This isn't right," he muttered under his breath. Another officer flipped through the initial reports. "The husband says she texted him right before it happened," he said, gesturing toward the phone records. "But the message's timestamp is off, and it was sent through cellular data instead of Wi-Fi." That detail alone suggested the text may not have come from inside the apartment. Meanwhile, at the hospital, doctors were preparing for the worst. Jessica's prognosis was unclear. The bullet had miraculously missed key areas of the brain, but the swelling was dangerous. A nurse adjusted the IV, monitoring the slow drip of fluids into Jessica's arm. Outside her room, officers stood guard. If she woke up, if she spoke, she might be able to tell them everything. Matthew had visited the hospital once since Jessica had been brought in. It was brief and he hadn't stayed long. He had stood at the doorway, his expression unreadable, then left without a word. A detective took note of it. "Husband doesn't seem too broken up," he muttered, watching Matthew's back as he disappeared down the hall. Back at the apartment, more evidence was being analyzed. The 911 call had been replayed multiple times, listened to carefully, dissected. Matthew's voice had sounded distressed, but something about it was measured. There was no raw panic, no hysteria. Investigators compared it to other 911 calls they had processed over the years. People who had just discovered a loved one with a gunshot wound typically reacted in one of two ways: either complete breakdown, sobbing, screaming for help, or a kind of shocked, numbed muttering. Matthew had sounded prepared. The officers continued listening, catching details that weren't obvious the first time. The way he emphasized that Jessica had shot herself. The way he made sure to establish his alibi immediately. The way his tone seemed to waver just enough, but not too much. They had heard it before, from people who had something to hide. Then the biggest revelation came from the forensic analysis of Jessica's phone. The last text message, the one Matthew claimed had been her final goodbye, had been sent several minutes after medical experts estimated that Jessica would have lost consciousness. That was impossible. The only conclusion? Someone else had sent that message. And if someone else had sent it, then they had done so to stage a suicide. Investigators felt a shift in the case. The pieces were beginning to take shape, forming a picture no one wanted to say out loud just yet. Jessica Boynton had been found barely alive, locked inside a closet, shot in the head, with no physical evidence that she had fired the weapon herself. Someone else had pulled the trigger, and now the hunt for the truth had officially begun. The station was cold. It always was, regardless of the season, but tonight the temperature seemed to bite deeper than usual. The air smelled faintly of stale coffee and paper. the kind of scent that settled into the walls of places where long hours and heavy conversations were the norm. The interview room was no exception. Sterile, gray, with a simple table, 3 chairs, and a single overhead light casting harsh shadows against the tiled floor. Seated on one side of the table, Matthew Boynton leaned back in his chair, his uniform crisp, his posture straight, his hands folded neatly in front of him. He was young, but his presence carried the practiced confidence of someone who had spent years in law enforcement. He wasn't just another citizen being brought in for questioning, he was one of their own. Across from him, the lead investigator flipped through a file, his fingers tracing over the latest findings. The weight of the silence in the room stretched long before he finally spoke. "We need to go over your statement again." Matthew nodded, his expression neutral. "I already told you everything," he said, his voice even. The investigator didn't look up. "Then humor me." Meanwhile, on the other side of town, Jessica Boynton remained unconscious in her hospital bed. Machines beeped in rhythmic succession, monitoring every vital sign, every subtle fluctuation in her condition. Doctors had stabilized her, but the prognosis remained uncertain. Brain swelling was the biggest concern. If she woke up, there was no guarantee that she would remember anything. Or worse, if she woke up, she might remember everything. Outside her hospital room, an officer stood stationed by the door. He wasn't there to guard her against an external threat. He was there because, for the first time since this investigation began, the authorities weren't sure who might be walking the hallways, waiting for an opportunity to finish what had been started. Jessica was no longer just another victim. She was a witness. Back at the station, the interrogation continued. The investigator moved carefully, knowing that pressing a fellow officer too hard, especially one from a well-connected law enforcement family, could backfire. But there were too many loose ends, too many details that didn't add up, and he wasn't about to let them slip by unanswered. "You said she sent you a text message," the investigator said, glancing at the document in front of him, "telling you she was going to end things." Matthew nodded. "That's right. What time did you get that message?" Matthew hesitated only for a fraction of a second, but that pause was enough to be noted. "I don't remember the exact time," he said. "A little after I left Waffle House." The investigator tapped his pen against the table. "The thing is, we pulled the metadata from her phone." He let the words settle, watching for any reaction. "That message was sent after she was already unconscious." Matthew's jaw tightened, his fingers twitching slightly where they rested on the table. It was the first real break in his composure. I don't know what to tell you," he said quickly. "That's what she sent me." The investigator slid a printed report across the table. "The text wasn't sent from inside your apartment," he said. "It was sent using cellular data, not Wi-Fi." He leaned in slightly. "Meaning someone had Jessica's phone outside of that apartment." Matthew's shoulders squared. "Are you accusing me of something? I'm just trying to understand how that text got sent when she couldn't have sent it herself." Silence. Long. Heavy. Then Matthew exhaled sharply, shaking his head. "I don't know," he muttered. "I don't know how that happened." The investigator let the silence stretch. He had been doing this long enough to know that when people didn't have the right answer, they filled the empty space with something else. Excuses, contradictions, slips. But Matthew didn't say anything else. Not yet. At the hospital, another conversation was unfolding. Detectives had begun questioning those closest to Jessica. Friends, co-workers, anyone who might shed light on her state of mind before the night she was found in that closet. The more they spoke to people, the more a pattern emerged. Jessica had been planning to leave. Not just thinking about it, not just considering it, actively planning. She had confided in a close friend just days before the incident, saying she was gathering her documents, preparing for a custody battle, getting ready to move out. She had been afraid, but she had been determined. "She told me she was going to leave him," the friend said, her voice trembling. "She said she was scared, but she was ready." That detail sent a ripple through the investigation. Jessica's intention to leave changed everything. If she had been found dead that night, it would have ended any custody battle before it even began. That meant someone had a motive. The final breakthrough of the night came when investigators obtained a warrant to examine Jessica's phone records more thoroughly. They found something. Buried in the call logs was an outgoing call, one that had been placed after Jessica had already suffered the gunshot wound. It had been placed to a contact saved in her phone under a name that didn't exist. Whoever had made that call had used Jessica's phone after she was already incapacitated. That meant someone else had been in control of her device, and that meant everything they thought they knew about the timeline of that night was about to fall apart. The walls of the Griffin Police Department had heard their share of confessions, lies, and desperate alibis over the years. But this case was different. It wasn't just another domestic dispute gone wrong. It wasn't a straightforward tragedy. Something had been manipulated, covered up, and twisted into a narrative that didn't make sense. And as the pieces of evidence stacked higher, the inconsistencies were becoming impossible to ignore. Inside the cold, fluorescent-lit office of the lead investigator, a team pored over the latest discovery, the outgoing call from Jessica's phone. The timestamp placed it at a time when, medically speaking, Jessica should not have been able to make any movements, let alone dial a number. The call had lasted only a few seconds, as if someone had pressed the call button and then ended it abruptly. Whoever had done this wasn't trying to reach someone. They were sending a message. Jessica's phone, now a key piece of evidence, had been thoroughly analyzed, its call logs, text history, and metadata picked apart for any anomalies. It had initially seemed like a routine check, but this changed everything. The contact that had been dialed wasn't listed under a recognizable name. It was a generic placeholder, a random sequence of letters, as if it had been intentionally buried among other contacts to avoid drawing attention. But once investigators traced the number, what they found made the room go silent. The number was linked to a disposable burner phone. Someone had used Jessica's phone to call another device that couldn't be traced to an individual. Who had that burner phone? Why was that number stored in Jessica's contacts? A detective ran a hand over his face, exhaling slowly. Someone else had been in control of Jessica's phone after she had been shot, and that someone had made a call that seemed almost insignificant, except it wasn't. It was a loose thread in a carefully staged crime scene. At the hospital, Jessica remained motionless, her body held together by machines and medical intervention. The rhythmic beeping of the monitors was the only indication that she was still fighting, still tethered to the world. Outside her room, an officer remained stationed at the door, a quiet but unmistakable presence. The investigation had turned, shifting from the assumption of an attempted suicide to the real possibility of an attempted murder. And now, with the latest forensic evidence, there was no longer just a possibility. There was proof that someone else had orchestrated the events of that night. The discovery of the call had changed the dynamic of the case. If someone had staged the scene, it meant they had time to do it. But how much time? Investigators returned to the one thing that couldn't lie: surveillance footage. The security footage from the apartment complex had already been analyzed once, but now, with fresh eyes and new suspicions, detectives combed through it again. The timestamp of the 911 call had been confirmed. Matthew had called emergency services after hearing a gunshot. But there was a window of time before that call was made, a stretch of minutes that investigators now knew was critical. And that's when they saw it. A shadow. It was brief, fleeting. A figure moving near the apartment before Matthew's car pulled up. The image was grainy, the lighting poor, but it was unmistakable. Someone had been there before Matthew arrived. Who? A civilian? A friend? Or someone who had been inside that apartment, locked inside that closet with Jessica? The interrogation room at the station had been used all night, and it was about to be occupied again. Matthew Boynton had been cooperative up to this point, but there were new questions now, and they needed answers. The lead investigator walked into the room, his expression unreadable. He sat down across from Matthew, placed a folder on the table, and let the silence build. He knew how this worked. People under pressure either filled the silence or cracked under it. Finally, he spoke. "We pulled surveillance again," he said. "We found something." Matthew's gaze remained neutral. "Okay." The investigator flipped the folder open, revealing a series of still images taken from the footage. He tapped a grainy image, showing a blurred figure moving toward the building minutes before the 911 call was made. This person was near the apartment before you arrived. Matthew didn't react. Do you know who this is? A pause, just long enough to make the investigator take note of it. No, Matthew said. The investigator studied him. Are you sure? Matthew's jaw tightened just slightly. Yeah. The air in the room shifted. The detective leaned forward, lowering his voice just slightly. Because we also found an outgoing call on Jessica's phone. A call made after she was unconscious. A call to a burner phone. This time, Matthew blinked. And that burner phone, the investigator continued, was connected to someone we intend to find. For the first time since this interrogation had begun, Matthew looked nervous. At the hospital, Jessica's vitals remained steady. Doctors monitored her brain activity, watching for any sign of improvement. There was still no telling what she would remember, if she would remember anything at all. But one thing was clear. Whoever had been inside that apartment with her didn't think she would survive. And now, with every new piece of evidence, it was becoming clear that they had been wrong. The Griffin Police Department was no stranger to complex cases. Officers had seen their fair share of crime, of deception, of desperate attempts to conceal the truth. But there was something about this case, something that didn't fit neatly into the usual patterns. It wasn't just the inconsistencies in the crime scene, the contradictions in statements, or the forensic evidence that defied the initial story. It was the presence of another player, someone unseen, someone whose involvement was hinted at in shadows and fragments of digital breadcrumbs. The discovery of the outgoing call from Jessica's phone had cracked the case open in a way no one expected. It wasn't just a mistake, it was a deliberate action, taken at a moment when Jessica was already incapacitated. Someone had used that phone, and that someone had something to hide. Detectives worked fast. The burner phone that had received the call was their next lead, and in an age where nearly everything left a digital footprint, even an unregistered device could be traced if the person using it wasn't careful. The first step was pulling records. Despite being a disposable phone, the device had been active long enough to make multiple calls, a mistake that would prove costly for whoever was on the other end. While the number itself wasn't tied to a name, it pinged off a cell tower near the same location Matthew Boynton had been at earlier that night. That was no coincidence. If the call had been made from Jessica's phone after she had already been shot, and it had gone to a burner phone located near Matthew's known whereabouts, then someone he knew, or Matthew himself, had been involved in staging the crime scene. Investigators needed to find out who had that burner phone, and they needed to find out fast. Meanwhile, Jessica remained in the intensive care unit, her condition still critical. The swelling in her brain had gone down slightly, but she hadn't woken up. Doctors monitored her closely, running tests, tracking brain activity, watching for any sign that she might regain consciousness. She was stable. But the question everyone was asking was no longer if she would survive. It was when she would wake up, and what she would say when she did. Outside her hospital room, law enforcement remained on guard. The shift rotation had been doubled. No one was taking chances. There was a growing concern that whoever had been responsible for her condition might not be finished yet. If Jessica survived, if she could speak, if she could confirm what investigators were beginning to suspect, then the person who had tried to end her life might not wait around for the legal system to catch up. Jessica wasn't just a victim anymore. She was a threat to whoever had tried to silence her. The lead detective sat at his desk, staring at the list of numbers connected to the burner phone. It had been used sparingly, only a few calls, all brief, all at odd hours. But there was one number that stood out, a number that wasn't random, a number that belonged to someone in law enforcement. A knot formed in the detective's stomach. This was the kind of case that could shatter careers, the kind that could bring heat down on an entire department. It was bad enough that the primary person of interest was a police officer, but if there were more people involved, if someone had helped cover it up, then this wasn't just a case of domestic violence or attempted homicide. This was something bigger. The detective made a call of his own, bringing in a request for outside assistance. If this case had corruption tangled in it, it couldn't be handled internally. The Georgia Bureau of Investigation would be notified. It was time to pull the whole case apart. At the police station, Matthew was called back in for further questioning. He had cooperated so far, but something about his demeanor had shifted. The pressure was mounting. The investigators weren't letting up. The gaps in his story were widening, and the more they uncovered, the less control he seemed to have over the narrative. This time, when he walked into the interrogation room, he was met with more than just the standard questioning. This time, he was handed a photograph. The security footage still. The grainy, shadowed figure moving near his apartment before he had arrived home that night. The moment he saw it, something flickered across his face. Not shock, not confusion. Something else. Something closer to recognition. Back at the hospital, Jessica's fingers twitched. It was small, barely noticeable, but it didn't go unnoticed by the nurse checking her vitals. She made a note, adjusted the monitors, and called for the doctor. Jessica was showing signs of emerging from unconsciousness, and if she woke up, the entire case would take a new turn. The atmosphere inside the hospital was thick with anticipation. Doctors and nurses moved with careful precision, their focus trained on one particular room, a room that, for the past several days, had held the key to unraveling a mystery that had gripped the Griffin Police Department. Jessica Boynton had survived a gunshot wound to the head. She had defied the odds, lingering in a fragile limbo between life and death, suspended in a world of silence, while investigators scrambled to piece together the truth about what had happened to her. And now, she was waking up. The machines around her beeped steadily, tracking her vitals. Her eyelids fluttered, the involuntary twitches signaling a shift in her consciousness. The medical staff had seen this before, a slow, careful climb back to awareness. No one knew what she would remember. No one knew if her mind had held on to the moments before she collapsed inside that locked closet. But if she did remember, that could change everything. Outside her hospital room, the air was tense. A uniformed officer stood at his post by the door, shifting his weight from one foot to the other, his eyes scanning the hallway for anything out of place. He wasn't just there to protect Jessica. He was there to make sure nothing happened to her. The idea that someone might want her dead wasn't paranoia anymore. In another wing of the hospital, a group of detectives had taken over an empty conference room, its long table now cluttered with files, printed call logs, forensic reports, and still frames from the surveillance footage that had thrown a wrench into everything they thought they knew. The shadowy figure seen outside Jessica's apartment before Matthew had arrived, the one they still hadn't identified, had become a focal point of the investigation. Who was it? Who had been near that apartment in the moments before Jessica had been found bleeding inside that closet? Investigators had run the footage through enhancement software, trying to sharpen the grainy image, but the lighting had been too poor, the angle too imperfect. Still, they knew it was someone who had no reason to be there. And now, as Jessica's body slowly began to fight its way back to wakefulness, the stakes had risen. If she could talk, if she could tell them what had happened, then maybe, just maybe, they could connect the dots before it was too late. At the police station, Matthew Boynton sat in silence, his arms crossed as he stared down at the table in front of him. The walls around him felt smaller than they had before. The air inside the interrogation room felt heavier. He had been brought back in for questioning, not formally under arrest, not yet, but he could feel the weight of suspicion pressing against him. They had shown him the surveillance footage, the blurry image of the mystery figure near his apartment before he arrived. They had told him about the outgoing call from Jessica's phone to a burner number. They had made it clear that this was no longer being investigated as a suicide attempt. And yet, despite everything, despite the walls closing in, Matthew refused to say anything that could be used against him. He was careful, measured, too aware of what was happening. But there was one thing he hadn't anticipated. Jessica wasn't dead. She was waking up. And if she could talk, then everything he had carefully constructed could crumble in an instant. Back at the hospital, the tension inside Jessica's room was palpable. Her breathing had changed. The faintest movement of her fingers had evolved into more distinct twitches. A murmur slipped past her lips, too soft to be understood, but unmistakably a sound, a sign that her consciousness was stirring. A nurse leaned in. "Jessica?" A pause. Another breath. Then her eyelids fluttered again, her head shifting slightly. The machines beeped faster, responding to the increase in her heart rate. The officer outside the door heard the commotion and stepped inside. His radio buzzed. A call was made to the detectives stationed downstairs. She was waking up, and someone needed to be there to hear what she had to say. The hospital room was eerily silent, save for the rhythmic beeping of the monitors and the occasional murmur from the nurses. The air was thick with anticipation. It had been days since Jessica Boynton was found in the closet, barely clinging to life, her body defying all odds to survive a gunshot wound that should have killed her. Now her body was waking up, and soon so would her mind. Jessica's fingers twitched against the sheets. The subtle movements had grown stronger over the past few hours, each one marking another step toward full consciousness. Her breathing, once shallow and unsteady, had deepened. Her eyelids fluttered more frequently, as if she was fighting her way through a dense fog, inching closer to the surface. The nurse on duty leaned forward, watching for any sign that this was it, that she was about to wake up completely. The tension in the room was palpable, heavy with the knowledge that whatever Jessica said next could shift the entire course of the investigation. Outside her room, detectives were waiting. The Georgia Bureau of Investigation had officially taken over, their presence unmistakable as they lined the hallways in dark suits and unreadable expressions. The case was no longer just about what had happened to Jessica. It was about what had been covered up. And if she remembered anything, if she could name a suspect, then everything that had been carefully concealed up to this point would come undone. At the police station, Matthew Boynton sat in a different kind of silence. It wasn't the sterile stillness of a hospital room. It was the suffocating weight of an interrogation room where the walls felt like they were closing in. Detectives had brought him back in for further questioning, not yet under arrest. But the energy in the room had shifted. The questions were sharper now, the pauses between them longer, leaving space for discomfort to settle in. They knew something. He could feel it. The still images from the surveillance footage, the forensic inconsistencies, the phone call from Jessica's phone to the burner number. It had all added up to something undeniable. The investigators weren't just asking questions anymore. They were waiting for him to slip. The lead detective sat across from him, arms resting on the table, fingers lightly tapping against the surface. "We need to talk about the footage," he said, his tone calm, calculated. Matthew exhaled slowly, shaking his head. "I already told you. I don't know who that is." The detective studied him. "Then let's talk about the phone records, because we found something that doesn't make sense." Another pause. "You said you got a text from Jessica, a goodbye text. But that text was sent after she was already unconscious, after she had already been shot." A flicker of something crossed Matthew's face. "And now she's waking up." His posture stiffened. "She's going to tell us what happened," the detective continued, his voice calm, deliberate. "So if there's anything you want to say, now's the time." But Matthew said nothing. Not yet. Back at the hospital, Jessica's breathing hitched. Her head shifted slightly, her lips parting just enough for a shallow whisper to escape, a sound too soft to be understood. The nurse leaned closer, speaking in a gentle, coaxing tone. "Jessica, can you hear me?" A long pause. Then her eyes opened. It took her a moment to adjust, her pupils dilating against the harsh fluorescent lighting. Confusion flickered across her face, her gaze darting around the unfamiliar setting. "Jessica." The nurse tried again. Her throat was dry. It took effort, but finally she spoke. "Where am I?" Her voice was hoarse, barely above a whisper, but it was enough. She was back. The officer outside the room stepped inside, his radio already buzzing to alert the detectives downstairs. "She's awake," he said. "You need to get up here." Within minutes, a team of investigators had arrived. They didn't rush in with a barrage of questions. They knew better. A trauma victim had to be handled carefully. They had waited this long. They could wait a little longer. A doctor checked her vitals, speaking softly, explaining that she had been in the hospital for days, that she had survived, that she was safe. Jessica swallowed hard, her fingers gripping the blanket beneath her. There was something fragile about the way she lay there, something about the hesitation in her eyes that made it clear. She was struggling to put the pieces together. Then came the question. "Jessica, do you remember what happened?" A long pause, her brow furrowed. A flicker of something, fear, uncertainty, the weight of a memory she couldn't quite grasp. Finally, she opened her mouth, her voice barely audible. I don't know. The words hung in the air like a sudden drop in temperature. The detectives exchanged brief glances, their minds working through the implications. Did she really not remember? Or was there something buried beneath the fog of her injury, something too traumatic for her mind to process just yet? One of the detectives crouched slightly, making sure to keep his tone gentle. It's okay, Jessica. Just take your time. She blinked, her eyes glassy, her breathing uneven. There was something there, something just beyond reach. Then she whispered, I remember being scared. The room went silent. Another beat passed and she swallowed hard. I remember someone being there. The detective didn't move, didn't push her further. But his next question was the most important one yet. Jessica, do you remember who? Her breath hitched. She opened her mouth. And then suddenly panic flashed in her eyes. Her body tensed. Her heart monitor spiked, beeping rapidly as her breathing became erratic. Jessica, it's okay, the doctor said quickly, but her body was already trembling. Her mind knew something, but whatever it was, she wasn't ready to say it. Not yet. Jessica sat upright in the hospital bed, her body still weak but her mind slowly pulling itself out of the fog. The room was bright, sterile, the kind of place where time moved at a different pace. Every now and then, a nurse would check her vitals, adjust the IV, murmur something reassuring. But Jessica wasn't paying attention to any of that. She was trying to remember. It was there, just beyond her reach. A flicker of movement, a voice, the sensation of something cold pressed against her skull. A moment before everything went dark. But the harder she tried to grab hold of it, the more it slipped away. Outside the hospital, the investigation continued. Detectives had narrowed in on the burner phone, tracing its last known pings. It hadn't been active since the night of the incident, but before that, it had been used multiple times near a police station. That was enough to raise eyebrows. Had another officer been involved? Or had someone deliberately used a location like that to throw them off? The forensic team also re-examined the firearm evidence, but there was still no physical proof tying Matthew directly to the shooting. The lack of fingerprints, the absence of gunpowder residue on Jessica's hands, the inconsistencies in the bullet trajectory, all of it suggested a staged crime scene. But without a clear suspect or confession, there wasn't enough to make an arrest. The case was slipping into a dangerous gray area, where everyone knew something had happened, but proving it was another story. Jessica's progress in the hospital was slow, and frustratingly so. She remembered arguing with Matthew earlier that night. She remembered the way he spoke to her, cold, detached, as if he had already made up his mind about something. Then nothing. She didn't remember the gunshot. She didn't remember who had pulled the trigger. That was the worst part, the not knowing. She had been inside that closet. She had felt the darkness close in. And yet, the most critical detail, the moment that mattered most, was missing. The investigators weren't giving up. They went back through every detail, pulling apart Matthew's timeline. Security footage showed him arriving home when he said he did. But the figure near the apartment minutes before still hadn't been identified. The burner phone remained a dead end, disappearing from the grid after that night. Jessica's text message was proven to be fake, but there was no way to prove who sent it. Matthew's alibi held, technically. Without Jessica's memory, they were stuck, and Matthew knew it. He wasn't cocky about it, but there was a quiet certainty in the way he carried himself when he walked out of the police station after questioning. He knew they couldn't touch him, because knowing the truth wasn't enough. You had to prove it. Weeks passed. The media attention surrounding the case grew, with local news outlets questioning whether justice was being served. The Griffin Police Department faced scrutiny. How had this been handled? Had one of their own been protected? But without enough evidence to file charges, the case hit a dead end. Jessica, meanwhile, was recovering physically, but her mind remained fractured. She wanted to remember. She needed to remember. But the memory refused to surface, buried beneath layers of trauma. In some ways, it was worse than never waking up, because now she was trapped in limbo, alive but without answers. Then came the final blow. The official ruling on the case. After reviewing the available evidence, the Georgia Bureau of Investigation announced that there was no conclusive proof that Jessica had been attacked by someone else. The case was closed as a self-inflicted gunshot wound. Despite the inconsistencies, Matthew walked free. There were no charges, no consequences, just silence. Jessica stared at the newspaper article announcing the decision. No charges filed in Boynton's shooting case. She had survived. She had fought. But in the end, it hadn't mattered. The truth, her truth, was locked away somewhere inside her mind, just out of reach. And Matthew? He moved on. He continued his life as if nothing had happened, because officially, nothing had. But deep down, everyone knew. Her family knew. Her friends knew. The detectives who worked the case, who saw the evidence, knew. Something had happened in that apartment, and the person responsible had walked away. Thank you for watching our video. Please subscribe, follow us, and leave a comment. It truly helps us keep bringing you gripping and thought-provoking true crime stories.